Congressman Smith, tell me about the National Institute of Health's new national research strategy to combat Lyme disease. What is this new initiative and this new plan going to do to help treat, combat Lyme disease, help provide funding for everything you need to again, treat it and prevent it and make people more aware about the disease?
Sure. Well, Ben, the idea behind the NIH new national strategy is something that I've been pushing since 1998. I introduced a bill called the Lyme Disease Initiative of 1998, and one bill after another, every successive Congress, lots of co-sponsorships with, Democrats and Republicans joining me, and we could not get it done. We would run up to a brick wall, and they just wouldn't want to do it. We finally convinced the National Institutes of Health that this is a chronic and ever-expanding disease, and it has a lot of co-infections, not just Lyme, but the ticks are carrying a hybrid of sickness and pathogens. And so, frankly, we've been able to convince them. Donald Trump, I contacted his domestic policy advisor since he's been in office, and they took it very seriously. I also talked to Azar, who's the HHS secretary, and a cabinet member about this a year and a half ago, and said, this has to get done. We've got too many sick people. It's growing. So what NIH has done is it's a 5-point national strategy, which will lead to a very serious increase, and I think this is important, in how much we spend for research. Now it's about $30 million, just under. It needs to be quadrupled, tripled at least, if not quadrupled, to get to that critical mass of research that will find a cure, that will find a diagnostic that works. Right now, most people get false negatives. They're told they don't have it from the tests that are being administered by most doctors. So they walk around thinking, oh, I don't have Lyme, I have something else, when they indeed have Lyme. There are a few testing assets on the market, including one by Agenix, that really costs a lot, but it does discover whether or not you have it, and it's an accurate read. But most of the doctors and do not do that. Now, the physicians would be further educated under this new initiative. Lots of research, basic research would be done into, again, diagnostics, treatment, and then the Centers for Disease Control is being called upon, and my understanding is that they're going to do this soon, increase their work on the prevalence issue. They've been undercounting the number of patients with Lyme disease terribly for decades. We now think the number is about at least 300,000 new cases every year, and as many as 437,000 cases each year. And the idea of chronic Lyme, persistent sickness, was trivialized and outright rejected for decades. That's now being accepted, that it's a very real problem. And the therapeutics that are being used to treat it now, a month of doxycycline, an antibiotic, does not work if you've been sick and did not catch it right at the beginning.
So this NIH multi-part plan, just to try to sum up and recap there, is looking for funding to expand knowledge of the disease, develop testing methods, and different prevention approaches for including vaccines?
Prevention and therapeutics to cure it. Right now, and this was brought out very, very vividly in the working group, another idea which I've pushed for 20 years. We finally got the working group in the 21st Century Cures Act, and that was vigorously opposed on the Senate side. We did get it enacted into law, and frankly, it was my idea. And now we have a situation where they have said, oh, wow, doctors don't know what to prescribe. There's no uniformity. There's no sense of this is what works. So NIH is now going to deploy real and serious funding and prioritization to finding a treatment that will cure the disease.
Congressman Smith, I know you're the co-chair of the Congressional Lyme Disease Caucus and have done a lot of work with the disease and trying to help prevent the disease in the last couple decades. So how have you seen the attention to this disease and the funding develop over the years in terms of looking for prevention methods, looking for vaccines, for treatments so that people don't have symptoms lingering on, and ways of trying to raise more awareness of it?
Well, it's been a very uphill battle. Very often one would have to find what we call a Lyme literate doctor, a man or a woman physician who gets it, who understands if it's chronic Lyme, it needs a very aggressive approach that often takes a couple of years in order to go into remission, if not a cure. And very often we're talking about remission. The spirochete, this terrible pathogen, which kind of looks like a corkscrew, finds its way throughout the body, especially in the brainstem, into the brain itself, and elsewhere. And it hides, it masquerades as other illnesses, including fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome. So the misdiagnosis out there by doctors, so often you'll find a Lyme patient with chronic Lyme who went through 15 or 20 doctors before they got the correct assessment and diagnosis as to what they were sick with, and that has to change dramatically. This is a beginning of an epidemic in terms of numbers, and it's growing. It's not just the Northeast anymore; it's throughout the entire country.
I think one of the things associated with Lyme disease that often gets maybe overlooked or not thought of as much by maybe just people in general is that they think that Lyme disease only strikes in the summertime when it's warm and all the bugs are out, the ticks are flying all over the place, but ticks are in fact year-round, and they're spotted all over the place. They've been, of course, the longhorn tick was spotted in Monmouth County last year, but sometimes the ticks can strike at any point of the year through the life cycle that they go through at any point of the year. So do you think that's a part of the disease that is being addressed more than it had been or should be addressed more in the future about education and educating people about what Lyme disease does, how to look out for ticks, not just in the summer, but maybe during the fall and the winter?
Ben, that's a great question. There are peaks, and of course the spring and into the summer is when the nymph stage of the tick is. Those ticks are very hungry and they're looking. I hate to put it this way, but for a blood meal, and if they latch on and they make you sick, it is because they're looking for hosts. And so it's a very, very serious situation, but it is a year-round issue. All of us have to be more aware if we go out and play sports, if we're walking in the grass, go hiking, whatever it might be. There has to be a tick check done upon return, to your home or whatever. I had a seminar on this. I've had several. I had a town meeting in the spring of this past year, and we had the CDC top person at the town meeting, and during the question and answer period, we got into, simple things one might do to mitigate, a tick bite. And if you've been out in the field, take a shower and really soap up and get all those areas where these things might hide, and then do a tick check as well. And that helps to, again, lessen. It's trying to make sure that you're less likely to get the bite. If you do have a tick, be very careful how it's removed. Taking out the mouth parts with a tweezer very, very carefully, because if it's agitated, it will just send in all of those sicknesses into your bloodstream. So, putting Vaseline on it or burning it with a match or whatever it might be, none of that works. Very carefully remove it. One of the greatest resources in the United States is right in our district. Pat Smith, and she's not related to me, but she's a wonderful leader from Wall Township. She runs the Lyme Disease Association. And, if people have additional questions, they could always contact my office, but also go to her website, because it is filled with overflowing with the latest and the greatest information, insights about this dreaded disease. One of the other things, then, that's very important is the fact that there are now, when somebody gets bit, sometimes if they get Lyme, they may get a whole lot of other things too. There's a co-infection problem where people are getting massively sick from a lot of other things that now are contained within these ticks. One thing that I'm working on right now, and I actually got a major piece of legislation, an amendment passed to the Defense Authorization Bill by the U.S. House of Representatives. It's now pending in the Senate. And that would be to empower and mandate that the DOD, Department of Defense Inspector General, look at how the United States government for decades was weaponizing ticks at Fort Detrick and at Plum Island, among other places. I've read several books on it. One of the books was called Bitten, B-I-T-T-E-N, by a woman named Chris Newby, an investigative reporter and journalist. She interviewed the man that is credited, named Bergdorfer, with discovering Lyme back in 1981. What none of us knew was that he was a weapons specialist. And he admitted all of this, provided her with documentation, files, and said that they filled millions of ticks, more than millions, with pathogens. And it was Richard Nixon in 1969 who put a halt to it, all offensive bioweapons testing and development of weapons. But to think that those ticks at Plum Island and elsewhere carried a witch's brew of sickness and pathogens is highly disturbing. So my amendment tasks the Inspector General of the Department of Defense to investigate, tell us what they did, to how many ticks, who, when, where, why, the whole thing, and then it might provide some leads on how we can combat this. If we know, I've had people just trivialize the amendment and say we've had Lyme for thousands of years. Not in this form, we haven't. Not with all of these other pathogens commingled with the Lyme disease spirochete, which causes the sickness. There was a game changer. And many of us, and I am a believer of this, as the IG could prove it true or false for the DOD, that this came right out of our weapons testing.
If and going along with that, if they were indeed weaponized, do you think this is something that's going to take years or even or decades to try to figure out how many ticks were used and how much they've multiplied over the years?
Maybe how much they multiplied, but certainly not what they did. No matter how hard, there may be a cover-up, obviously, but you start with the files that are already known to exist that Dr. Wally Bergdorfer kept. He's now deceased, but he did provide this interview with Chris Newby, and she's got photocopies of this information. And you say, look, for the public good, for the well-being and welfare of all Americans, we need to get to the bottom of how this happened. And the proximity of Plum Island, for example, off Long Island, to Lyme, Connecticut, and other areas that were greatly infected, is more than just a casual, or a suggestive bit of evidence. You juxtapose that with all of this other information that's out there. There was a tremendous book written called Lab 257 some years ago, and I read that one as well. And that got into the whole issue with documentation and heavily footnoted of what they were doing at Plum Island. And Fort Detrick is involved with this as well. I find it outrageous and really a crime that we were looking to degrade the ability of the Soviet Union and the East Bloc countries, because that's what the rationale was given, by destroying their livestock, but also their people through sickness, so that they would be unwilling or unable to carry on a protracted war. There are some weapons that are absolutely off limits. And again, that's why Richard Nixon in 1969 ordered the end of all offensive bioweapons testing. And there was also a United Nations convention that came into being that same year as well. So, but the legacy of all of that testing, and there's often been arguments made, and Lab 257, that book got heavily into how many times there were suspected leaks. Birds certainly could pick up the ticks when they landed in Plum Island. There's all kinds of real possibilities. And again, the heavily footnoted aspect of this clearly suggests that it's real. My hope is that the Inspector General will leave no stone unturned. I don't think it takes years at all. It could take months to get this, the veil of secrecy torn asunder, and we got to know. For the sake of people's health, what were they doing? To think that Dr. Bergdorfer was stuffing ticks with pathogens to see how well they would infect the lab rats and the animals that they had that they were putting in with the ticks to see how sick they got. That just raises the question of it's highly unethical, immoral, and the consequences. I believe we have many sick people in our own country because of it. I
want to circle back before we conclude a bit to the the NIH national strategy, just to kind of recap about expanding knowledge, identifying treatment success, and evaluating prevention approaches. So as we kind of recap here, so how will this new NIH initiative help with prevention, treatment, and awareness of Lyme disease?
Well, I think this is the blueprint for helping to ensure that people who are sick get well, The research will help come up with diagnostics so people will know yes or no, you have a tick-borne disease. 80%, as an estimate, of the tick-borne diseases are Lyme disease. And then on the treatment side, because there have been, a scatter type of just different things that have been approached, tried. Some things work, some things don't. Most doctors were told if you give 1 month of antibiotics, that's the end of Lyme disease. That is unmitigated nonsense. It is totally false. And yet that's been the modus operandi for decades, which is why I pushed so hard to have chronic Lyme recognized, and the NIH and the working group that preceded it, made very strong statements about we don't have a treatment that works, that's uniform, that's accepted, and we don't have a situation where chronic Lyme is even acknowledged. The Infectious Disease Society of America, you wonder what has been the opposition to all of this for years. They opposed every one of the bills that I offered, and there's more than a dozen of them over the course of 20 years. Major bills. At one point, I had 100 co-sponsors on my bill, could not get it moved. They were saying that Lyme disease is hard to catch, easy to treat. That was their phraseology. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's very easy to catch, and if it's left to the point where it's not caught in the first several weeks, and it goes a year or longer or whatever it might be, chronic Lyme is very hard to get excised out of the body. And, the chronic Lyme patients can tell you the nightmare that they have lived as they were told, oh, it's all in your brain. It's just a syndrome. Take some Prozac and call me in the morning. They are sick from a pathogen that is careening throughout their body and including in their brain. That's why the brain fog is so one of the telltale signs of Lyme disease.
Congressman Smith, thanks for taking out some time this morning to discuss the National Institutes of Health new national research strategy to combat Lyme disease and, of course, the ongoing fight with Lyme disease and all the work you've done over the last 20, 30 years in trying to help bring about awareness of Lyme disease, prevention methods and treatment methods, and certainly with all the other discoveries that you've made. And please keep all the good work you do with combating Lyme disease.
Ben, thank you so much. And know this, I have a new bill, relatively new, called the Tick Act. And the idea is, and I've, again, been pushing it for more than 20 years, is to have a whole-of-government strategy, and I do believe that's being done administratively by the Trump administration. I give them high marks because we have been unable, through Republican and Democrat administrations previous to this, to get this done. There was no NIH strategy like this under Obama, under Bush, under Clinton, and believe me, we tried. The whole idea of a whole-of-government approach is strategy. And we've done this in other things. I wrote our autism laws, 4 of them. We have a whole-of-government strategy on autism. We did it on Alzheimer's. I was a co-sponsor, not the prime sponsor on that bill, and that has made all the difference in the world. So we are trying that same principle for tick-borne diseases, including Lyme, and we have failed. I've tried so many times. The administration has now done it. And the Tick Act would codify it and strengthen it, but frankly, the NIH move for a national strategy with 5 key pillars is absolutely extraordinary and gives all of us who care about this issue, and I know it's you too, great hope that we're going to find answers. And
I think there's so many people, not just in New Jersey and the Jersey Shore, the area, the district that you cover here, but, across the country that are going to greatly benefit from all the work that's being put into these prevention and treatment methods and discovery into things about ways where money can come together and people in Washington can come together to help everybody across the country who are affected by this disease.
Exactly. Let me just say one other thing. I met with DeVos, the Secretary of Education, last week, as well as Dr. Fauci, who separate meetings, who's the NIH point person on this area, on this initiative for the NIH. But with the Secretary of Education, I emphasize that we need a situational awareness program. It needs to be done at the local school board level, right up to the very top, the Board of Education Department of the U.S. government, to promote best practices so that students who are out for gym in the grass, somebody's on the soccer team, the football team, whatever it might be, cross country, are aware that they need to be vigilant about Lyme disease. And someday, and maybe soon, we'll get to a vaccination. There was a vaccination on the market for a while for humans, but unfortunately it had some very serious side effects, allegedly, with arthritis. But we need to get that kind of protection as well, a vaccination.
Congressman Smith, thanks again for adding those couple new bills onto the end there. But certainly for all the work you've done and for taking out some time this morning, I really appreciate you calling in and discussing the new bills and then, of course, the bills that have made so much of an impact over the last couple decades.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Vin, for doing this, because I think you help to enlighten people, so that they can be more aware, and vigilance will help mitigate disease.